Welcome back to the KDPG Sunday edition. Our topic this morning is the Trump presidency and diplomacy as it stands right now. And our guests to discuss this topic are the Dr. Andrew Simpson, assistant professor of history at Duquesne University's McAnulty College of Graduate School of Liberal Arts, and Dr. Philip Harold, the professor of political science at Robert Morris University. David Tribman, the executive editor of the Post-Gazette, is away this week, so we have Sally Stapleton, the Post-Gazette's managing editor, with us. Sally?
Thank you. Yes. Let's look forward. 2 weeks ago, we didn't prognosticate very well on this show about what Trump would do for his nomination for the Supreme Court. Let's look at what he's going to do Monday with Putin. What do you anticipate? As he's already kind of lowballed expectations, saying there's not a lot that's going to be coming out of this. We're meeting and hoping to develop a good relationship. What are your thoughts about what this could bring? As a historian, we're terrible prognosticators, so I'm going to leave it to the political scientist.
Sure. So there's a lot of issues on the agenda. I mean, there's the arms reduction treaty that's going to expire in a few years. There's definitely the election hacking. Trump is going to have to bring that up. Putin will deny it. I mean, we can anticipate that dance in advance, I think.
Yeah, as the president said, don't expect any Perry Mason moment on that one. Right.
So the substantive issues, I think, are arms reduction, Crimea, status of Crimea, annexed by Russia, resulting in all these sanctions on them by the United States and Europe, and then status of Syria. So I don't think there's necessarily going to be any big dramatic breakthrough with just one kind of short, Trump described it as a loose one-on-one meeting, but it'll lay the groundwork potentially for the diplomats to speak to each other and really decide the future of Syria. So, there's a potential overlap of interest there, Russia and the US. We don't want to be there forever, neither does Russia. We don't want Islamic State to be strong. We don't want Iran to control it, so does Russia. So Israel doesn't want Iran border. So really there can be some substantive discussions about how we're going to negotiate that, put pressure on Iran, and kind of de-escalate that conflict, and then also what the status of the Crimea will be.
No prognostications on your part?
Well, I mean, I think what we're going to see is the sort of fear of allies who are worried about the president going and meeting one-on-one with Vladimir Putin. We're going to justified. We're also going to see if the worries back home among congressional Democrats of the president meeting with Vladimir Putin are justified. The reality is we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if this will be something where we have a lot of pomp and circumstance and not much follows out of it, or we don't know if these substantive issues are going to be addressed and hammered out, and we're going to walk out of this meeting with, if not an answer to Russian election interference, certainly an answer to other questions about what's happening on the international stage.
Interesting thing that I think is that we've already noted how the president will use a certain approach and make comments about people with whom he's going to be going in to negotiate, and not necessarily have been necessarily good. He'll tear down what their country is doing or how it's not good for the United States. He doesn't do that with Vladimir Putin and Russia that much. Is it a different tactic? That's a good point.
I don't think any of us have an answer for you. That's certainly something that diplomats, pundits, journalists have been scrambling to figure out. And it might be strategy, it might not be, we don't know.
You brought up the congressional, I'm sorry, were you going to add to something? You brought up the congressional Democrats a moment ago. The president in his news conference with Theresa May on Friday indicated that when he was asked about dealing with Putin, he immediately veered off to the course of saying that the, as he calls it, the witch hunt, the Mueller investigation is tying his hands in some ways in dealing with Russia. Has this congressional, I mean not the congressional, but the Mueller investigation hurt him and able to deal diplomatically?
Yes, absolutely, with the sanctions. So that created this whole climate of anti-Russia animus that led to adding more sanctions onto Russia. The sanctions have significantly hurt Russia, upwards of 10% of their economy. And it's a steep price that Putin has paid for annexing the Crimea. So he's not going to give that up. Trump might dangle out this possibility of recognizing that. That might be too far even for Trump. But definitely the measures that Trump has taken against Russia, expelling the diplomats in the wake of the England poisoning and the sanctions were not necessarily things that he wanted to do, but his hand was forced.
And I think, to your point, it comes back to what Congress is able to do. And part of what happens is whatever deal comes out of this meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, that then comes back to the United States and is refracted against the light of a midterm elections, where we have an ongoing set of hearings. If you look at what happened this week with Peter Strzok and the FBI, which was supposed to be about Russia and sort of veered off in a number of different directions.
Oh, did it ever veer off? Yeah.
But you also have the sort of calculus of members of the House and the Senate who know that Russia plays a role in domestic politics, and it plays a role in how they position their relationship to or against the administration.
So look at the timing of this Monday conference. Russia's been basking in what I think most would call a very successful World Cup. Now, Russia made it much farther. In fact, I think fans were very anti-Russian team until they started winning, and then the whole country embraced them. So that's a win. The infrastructure, you're not hearing huge complaints about the infrastructure, even though they're scattered all over. And it'll be the meeting off the party from the final. So Putin is coming into this with a very high world view, following what people questioned. Does this put President Trump at a disadvantage?
I think Russia feels good about itself. Absolutely. I think, America, what President Trump inherited was a foreign policy that was really in shambles. So, Iraq, Afghanistan, these never-ending wars, spending trillions of dollars, not necessarily increasing American security at all, Libya and Syria. He was kind of dealt a weak hand, and he's trying to make the best of that he can. And really, art of the deal, it's, I think there's a great piece by David Ignatius saying the book we should be looking at is Art of the Comeback, where Trump was overcoming possible personal bankruptcy by sweet-talking and threatening the bankers to loan him $65 million more that he could use then to restore his empire in the 90s. So, he is dealing with an American public that I think is war-weary and trying to make the best of that. And the same with Vladimir Putin. I mean, they're coming off the high of the World Cup, but Russia is not some great big industrial state. It's not the Soviet Union. That has collapsed. It's basically France with more natural resources. So they're both dealing with weaker hands.
I do want to push back a little bit on that, because I think, to be fair, we have to look at the broader sweep of American foreign policy. And part of the problem with the way that we've characterized the sort of last year and a half of foreign policy is that it's been a product of the previous administration. And I think we need to understand that this sort of perpetual state of war is something that goes back several administrations, and in fact goes back even further. And these are broader changes in American foreign policy that we're confronting at this moment. It isn't simply that Obama turned over the keys to a particular set of foreign policy problems. This is something, and this is me as a historian, right? This is something that has built over many decades.
And even back into the 90s with the free trade agreements made by Bill Clinton, Trump is very much against. And NATO expansion too, right? Expanding NATO right onto the borders of Russia.
But also including our relationship with Russia. Vladimir Putin's been in office now through several American presidencies. And that's certainly affected the way that the foreign policy establishment in the United States and the country has dealt with Russia. So this isn't just a sort of immediate run problem.
Right.
The way that the president handled his negotiations with the leader of North Korea, does that play a part in any of this from Putin's perspective?
I think so. I mean, I think you have to look at that. You have to look at that. That North Korea summit, I think we categorize as a success thus far. We'll have to see how that plays out. But we're certainly better off than we were a year ago, where there's threats of nuclear war going back and forth. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Putin sees this style of personal attacks, ratcheting up the rhetoric, and then making a deal. So I think that'll play into the cards.
I want to pivot here a little bit because we only have a couple of minutes left. Sure. But and that is, let's go to the future past Putin and November and the elections there. Where do you think it stands now for President Trump and the Republican Party going into that election, and obviously the Democrats?
I think we don't know. We've got a couple big open questions on the table in terms of what's happening with the election. One of the largest is the Supreme Court, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. Depending on when those confirmation hearings are scheduled, bringing a Supreme Court fight into a midterm election will animate partisans on both sides. We've already seen that ad buys are going up by people who are opposed to and supporting Judge Kavanaugh. They're running in places like Maine and Alaska, which aren't surprising, but they're also running in places like West Virginia, North Dakota, and other states where we have vulnerable Democrats and perhaps moderate Republicans. And that's going to bring people certainly out to the election. We certainly have seen that during the primary cycle on both sides. We've seen candidates who tend to be on the sort of farther extremes of both sides of the party winning races and knocking off establishment figures. So if voter energy turns out, this will be a very spirited midterm. And it's not clear whether the House will flip or whether the House will stay. It's going to be a longer haul for the the Democrats to flip the Senate.
Right.
But again, we don't necessarily know. And I think that is something that's animating President Trump's strategy as well moving forward, understanding that there's domestic political considerations that are often tied to foreign policy.
I'm going to give you about 15 seconds.
Yeah, Drew is exactly right about that. The crucial poll is in the 2016 election, 1 out of 5 voters said the Supreme Court was the single most important issue, and 1 out of 4 Trump voters said that is the reason why we're voting for Trump. So this animates a lot of people, and I think it's perfect timing. Kennedy's retirement is perfect timing for the Republicans in the midterm.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us this morning on the KDPG Sunday edition. Sally and I will be back with some final thoughts in just a moment.